Access control starts with identification. Identification, quite simply, identifies the user or the process trying to get onto our systems. Now, good practices for identification start with the fact that we should only grant an ID to the person who does require that. This means we have a secure and trusted registration process that may require approvals before a person gets access. Here we can see a tremendous difference, however, between access that is being granted to an internal employee and someone who's being able to create an account on our web page. Even on our web page, we often put in CAPTCHAs and other types of techniques to try to ensure that we are not creating then user process or user identifications for some type of a bot that could create thousands of user IDs on our system and maybe cause some form of resource exhaustion or try to take advantage of some type of service that we offer. So this should be a secure registration process. Every ID should be unique. Shared IDs mean we lose accountability. We lose the ability to associate an activity on a system with a person or process that then executed that activity. So a good user ID is something which is a unique identifier for that particular entity. What we're trying to do is to ensure we can identify who are the authorized users. This will allow us to prevent unauthorized users from gaining access to our systems, networks, buildings, and of course our data and applications. But in addition to preventing unauthorized users from gaining access, we also have to ensure that those who are authorized to gain access to our systems, networks, and data are also limited that they only gain the appropriate level of access. This will prevent an authorized user then from gaining improper access. We also enforce things like session timeout. If a session where a person is logged in has been inactive for a certain length of time, we'll often then lock that session so that it cannot be then used by somebody else. The next step in the identification process and the access control process is to validate or to prove that identity. And this is often called authentication. Authentication validates that a person who claims to be, "Hi, I'm John." We can prove that they truly are John. And this is usually done by one of three methods. They know John's password, in other words, what you know. Or they have John's ID card or his token, that is what we'll call what you have. Or they have John's fingerprint with biometrics, or what we could say is what you are. But none of those three forms of authentication, what you have, what you know, and what you are, is good enough on its own. They can all be bypassed or defeated by a determined criminal. So therefore, we bring in the concepts here of strong authentication. Strong authentication is when we'll use a combination of two of those three factors. We may require a person to be able to put in a PIN number as well as, for example, have the correct fingerprint. That would be two-factor because it's a combination of something you know, the PIN number, with something you are, the biometrics. We also try to protect our access control by ensuring that people choose strong passwords. We create password rules that say what characteristics a good password would have, and try to avoid a situation where a person has chosen a password which could be very easy to guess. We also put in rules that prohibit the sharing of passwords and sharing of user accounts. This will allow us then to ensure that we don't have several people using, for example, an administrator account. So that if a person did make a change to the system, we at least know who made that change. When it comes to passwords, obviously this is something we would say something you know. We often put in rules such as upper and lowercase letters, they must use a special character, and we, of course, provide then that rule that that password should not be shared with anybody else. We also have rules regarding password length and passwords to say how frequently a password will have to change. Following these types of rules will make a password much more resistant to a brute force attack. A brute force attack where a person tries all sorts of different password combinations so they could log into that person is of course a great risk to the organization. However, we also have a type of attack known as a dictionary attack. A dictionary attack is where we try to guess a person's password based on common words. We know that in many cases a person chooses a password which is based on a fairly common word that could be found in a dictionary. And several of the tools that are out there will then use dictionaries of different languages to try to see if possibly one of these common words was actually that person's password. And many of these dictionary attack type of systems will also then do substitutions of O's and zeros, E's and threes, and some of the common techniques people use to make their password a little bit harder, even though it's still based on a common word. We should make sure that passwords are required to be changed on a scheduled basis. Now, this again comes down to risk. If the risk is quite high, we might set that scheduled basis to be every 15 days. If it's a moderate risk, maybe we'll force a person to change their password every 30, 45, or 60 days. In all these cases, we have to remember that when we force a person to change their password, we also then create an awful lot more work for the help desk, where people, of course, have to call in because they forgot what they changed their password to. We also create an impact on performance and productivity, where people are unable to get access because they forgot their new password as well. Quite often when we change passwords, we'll also enforce rules that would prevent then the reuse of an old password. Maybe we keep a history of the last 3 passwords, for example. But it's important that we also have some type of password recovery system. The ability of a person to be able to recover their password, maybe through knowing a secret question, maybe through some other type of password distribution, maybe through an SMS, or maybe the password is kept in escrow with a trusted third party. This can try to minimize the impact of a person then forgetting their password. One of the areas we always have to be a little bit careful of are people that have high-level access to systems. As auditors, we should always check who has an administrator account on the system, because that administrator account has a higher level of access and therefore a higher level of risk. This justifies a higher level of control. An administrator may, of course, be limited to only then being able to execute certain tasks when they are in a certain position. Let's go to a mainframe, for example. On a mainframe, there are certain tasks on a mainframe that can only be executed if you're physically located at the operator console. The operator console records and types everything that's being entered in. This prevents an administrator or operator from doing something that they can claim later, well, I didn't do that. It also then prevents someone from being able to log in remotely and execute a high-level command. And there are many of our systems that actually have administrator ports or management ports, where that creates a higher level of control requiring physical access to be able to actually make a change to that system. One of the unfortunate realities is that IT is often one of the worst departments for sharing then user accounts. Many people share the administrator account, which means that we don't really know who it was that made a specific change to a system. We also should have in place some type of password recovery for the administrator password. So there's no way then that the administrator password could be lost, which could make our systems unreachable or unmaintainable. Keeping our password with a trusted third party or a trusted third party location would be called then to keep our password in escrow. Quite often, an administrator also will be required to change their password more often than other users. This means that even if the password was then stolen or compromised, the time period for which that password would be effective has been then shortened down. It is a very important point, though, that it doesn't matter how good my administrator passwords are if we still have the default vendor account passwords on our systems. When that system was first installed, the vendor who put it in had an administrator account they used when they were setting up and configuring that system. And those accounts are often well known, or at least can easily be learned. And this is very often a point of compromise, where a person has installed a piece of equipment, and even though they have good password policies for their own users and administrators, that default vendor account is still available that could be used then by a hacker to gain access to the system.